Hello. Welcome to a discussion of Middle Ages architecture. This is really high creativity. Let's take a look at architecture during this wonderful period called the Middle Ages. First type of architecture that we want to talk about is called Romanesque. It means simply in the Roman manner. And everything done in Western European art and architecture between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of what we will call the Gothic period around 1100 was Romanesque. And let's just take a look at some Romanesque churches so that we can understand what the nature of Romanesque is all about. Here we see the inside and the outside of a Romanesque church. Notice that it has heavy walls. Most of these churches were built at the same time as heavy fortresses, and therefore they tended to be like castles in the way that they were built. They also had round arches, Roman, remember, and here you can see the windows have round tops, and inside the arches have round tops. You would not be surprised if you saw these things in ancient Rome. The windows were relatively small. The reason is that arches, although they're stronger than other forms such as post and lintel, they still don't let in a lot of light. You have to maintain a relatively small size because if you get too big, then the arch will collapse in the middle. The inside of the buildings were relatively small. They couldn't hold many people, and again, that was because the arch was somewhat restrictive in the ability to expand it in size. Because of the small windows and the relatively cramped quarters inside, the inside of these churches were relatively stark. It didn't do a lot of good to put paintings, and some are painted, but they're not especially elaborate because you didn't have enough light inside to be able to fully enjoy these paintings, so they're quite stark. Now I'd like to take you on a little tour of Romanesque churches. Let's just look at many of these churches and some of the windows and some of the interiors and some of the decorations, mostly, by the way, on the outside, but a few on the inside, so that you can get a feel for Romanesque, and that way when we come to the Gothic, you'll be able to make a good comparison. So here's a Romanesque church. You notice in every case round windows and heavy walls. Here's another you can see on the inside. It's relatively large. This is not a small church by any means, but it's got those round arches. Here's another. Looks like it's a fortress-like structure. Here is another that has some decorations on the inside, but again, quite fortress-like, and again, many round arches. Another shows a few decorations on the outside, angels, and here's one with a dog and a rabbit. I think they're kind of cute. Certainly part of the Roman style. Here's a Romanesque church that is more highly decorated on the outside. That became more common as time went on because people developed additional skills. Here's a wonderful church on the top of a pinnacle. This church is located not too many miles from Lyon, France. It is nothing else up on top of that pinnacle except just the church. And if you look closely, you'll see a very narrow pathway with stairs that lead the worshipers to the top of the church. You can go there if you like. It's evidently a beautiful place. Here's some other exterior shots as well as interior. They show, again, Roman arches. Here's another fortress-like structure, and here's a window, that very small Roman window. It looks like it might even be a window in a castle where they used to shoot arrows. Here's some exterior decorations. These are some, we might call them goblins, but they were meant to frighten away the evil spirits. Here's a decoration honoring a king. And here are other decorations. You can see the quite elaborate carvings on the stones. Here's a beautiful shot of an interior area where we have an arcade, that is a series of arches that gives a nice passageway. Here's another arcade, this one somewhat older, and you can see the Roman arches are in use. Here's inside with some decorations. It's a little bit hard to see the details of some of these paintings, but clearly the windows are small and round of the Romanesque style. Here's some more roof decorations or ceiling decorations, as well as relatively large interior. And here is yet another with some colored decorations and some light. There are decorations on the outside and even down in the basement. This is a crypt where there was a nobleman buried, and you can see the decorations even down in the crypt. Those are columns of the Greek type, and they are highly favored by the Romans as well. Now I'd like to describe to you an experiment that we could do in a classroom, and if you were in the classroom, I'd invite you to assist me. And this experiment involves 9 healthy volunteers, and what I do is line the 9 people up, 4 on each side, with 1 other person standing nearby, and then those 4 people across from each other put their hands on each other's shoulders, and then the 9th person climbs up on top and lays down on top of this roof that is created by the post and lintel system. It's very, very difficult to support someone when all you've got is post and lintels. And if you even try and arch a little bit, it gets easier. But if you put your arms up and each of the persons then makes a shape with their arms that looks like a peak of a house, and then the person gets up on top, you find it much easier to support that person. And to make it even easier, I then go behind the people and I ask others to assist me, and we press on their back. That is the concept behind the Gothic architecture. Let's take a look at this little video that shows how arches can be converted into Gothic arches. So here, the first video shows a Romanesque arch. It can be quite tall, and here you see the base of the arch expanded. We call those buttresses, and those buttresses allow the arch to go up in height so that it can withstand the forces above it. Now let's change that Romanesque arch to a Gothic arch. Here we see the Romanesque arch with the buttresses beginning. It grows higher and higher. Now we see it starting to become a peak, and we see the buttresses move outward and become what is known as flying buttresses. And that means that they are buttresses that are separated from the walls of the structure itself. The first person to ever use this kind of architecture did so at a church outside the center of Paris. Today it's within Greater Paris. You can even get there by a subway, and if you go to Paris, I recommend strongly that you take a subway ride to Saint-Denis. And this is one of the most important churches in ancient Paris. It's built on the burial site of Saint Denis, or Saint-Denis. He was beheaded for Christianity and then became the patron saint of France. This church is the national mausoleum of French royalty, and as you go into the church, you see scattered all over the bodies of French kings and queens. It's really very interesting to visit this church and see all of the French kings and queens. Well worth doing. It's again just north of downtown Paris. Well, in 1137 there was an abbot who was in charge of this church. His name was Abbot Suger. Very well respected abbot. And in fact, when the King of France left to go on the Second Crusade, Abbot Suger was left in charge of the government of France. So this is a well-respected man. He decided to repair this church. It had, over the years, kind of fallen down. And therefore, he decided that he would retain the good parts of the church. That was built at the time of Charlemagne. That would be in the early 800s. But he would add a rose window. And here we see a picture of the rose window from the church at Saint-Denis. Then, in addition to the rose window, that portion of the church that the roof needed to be strengthened, he would support it with Gothic arches. And therefore, he raised the roof and gave these Gothic arches. The reason he raised the roof is because that higher area inside would give a feeling of uplift and spirituality. And that was the real secret to the Gothic style. It was to allow more light inside the church and to give a feeling of elevation and closeness to God. So today, when you go to Saint-Denis, and here's a picture of it, you can see that it has mixed Romanesque and Gothic styles. It was characterized by the King of France as being a nice church, and certainly one where he would later be buried, but it wasn't enough as an impressive main church, and therefore the King of France decided that he would build a spectacular church. There was an island in downtown Paris, the island in the middle of the Seine River, and that was considered and had been considered for many, many years to be a holy site. Therefore, at this holy site on this island, the king decided that he would build the showplace church for all of France, and he would call it Notre Dame. Let's take a look at a brief video about the origins of Notre Dame.
1163, Paris. An army of construction workers, pulling endless loads of limestone, swarm over the Ile de la Cité, an island in the middle of the River Seine. The site has been sacred for thousands of years. It was first a Druid shrine that was transformed into a Roman temple for the god Jupiter, and later became a destination for Christian pilgrims honoring Saint Denis, who was tortured here and beheaded. Now, the King of France has ordered a new grand cathedral that will be the envy of all of Europe. That king was Louis VII. The cathedral is Notre Dame, to this day among the most magnificent ever built. Notre Dame would be the length of a football field, with walls towering 100 feet into the air. So big that it would engulf des Soulis' old church, which continued to hold services during the early years of Notre Dame's construction. Scaffolding provided a framework for lifting heavy equipment and materials, wooden braces, and stonework for constructing the vaults. An ingenious man-powered wheel crane mounted at the top of the scaffolding was used to lift the heaviest material. To build the cathedral, thousands of workers would spend their entire lives erecting these walls. In the past, builders with soaring ambitions had always been stymied by gravity. The crushing weight of a stone ceiling created too much outward stress on the walls. It may have even started out as an ingenious type of scaffolding to support the walls. But now, as architects scrawled out brilliant blueprints in the shadows of the rising structure, the solution of the flying buttress would become a design element for the ages. With this support, load-bearing walls could contain large cutouts for majestic windows that previously were impossible. The walls would have been too weak. By 1190, the south and north nave walls and lower vaults were erected. The western towers were also underway, rising independently to the height of the Great Western Rose Window, perhaps the most famous stained glass in the world. Cathedral of Notre Dame was finally completed in the mid-14th century, nearly 200 years after construction began. It was the symbol of an empire on the rise. Its grandeur and beauty was a harbinger of the power and glory to come.
There are certain elements of Notre Dame that obviously came from Saint-Denis. There are rose windows. In addition to that, there are the Gothic pointed arches. And you can see those in these pictures that we have, looking at one of the rose windows and then down the nave, showing the beautiful arches, and at the end of the nave, there is yet another rose window. So there's rose windows on either side of the transept and a rose window at the far end of the nave. Notre Dame also retained the characteristic exterior carvings, elaborate carvings in this case, of the Romanesque period. So here we see a facade of Notre Dame, and there are many angels and prophets and kings, and Christ and Mary being depicted on the exterior of Notre Dame. Here we also see some new elements that were added to Notre Dame. We see flying buttresses. Saint-Denis did not use flying buttresses, but certainly they are used in Notre Dame. In addition to that, we see a very much expanded church. It's huge compared to Saint-Denis. It's very, very high, and of course the flying buttresses. There's also a place across the street that I recommend to you. It's a little place where you can buy a crepe at lunch. All you have to do is, as you're looking at the facade of Notre Dame, on the left-hand side, the street side, you walk down that street, you come to the end of Notre Dame. At the end of the church, there's a very small park. Directly across the street from the church is the place where you buy the crepes at lunch. The man is a delight. He cooks them out on the sidewalk. I just recommend it. It's one of the fun experiences of Paris. After you get the crepe, they put it in a little, they fold it and put it in a little piece of paper. You can eat it in the park, or you can go just a few steps away and sit on the bank of the Seine River and watch the people go by and enjoy your crepe. In addition, Notre Dame has gargoyles. These gargoyles are meant, as I mentioned before, to frighten away the evil spirits. But in addition, these gargoyles, many of them, not all, but many, serve as drain spouts. Here you can see the drain spouts poking out from the side of Notre Dame. I have discovered the drain spouts by accident on a rainy day as I was walking down the sidewalk, and I became drenched as I walked underneath those drain spouts. So you must avoid the drain spouts on a day where there's a lot of rain. Now I want to tell you about something else. If you stand and face the facade of Notre Dame, the main entrance to Notre Dame, you can see this beautiful church. There's a very nice plaza there in front of Notre Dame. Turn 180 degrees, and so your back is toward Notre Dame. And then you walk 2 or 3 blocks straight ahead. You have to jog just a little bit, and you come down to a main road. And as you come to that main road, there's a large complex that today is the Ministry of Justice, and prior to the modern times, prior to the Revolution, was one of the palaces of the king. Inside that complex is a church called Sainte-Chapelle. And here we see a picture of the inside of Sainte-Chapelle, and also a picture of the beautiful stained glass windows. These windows are among the very best in the entire world. As you're sitting in Sainte-Chapelle, the windows on one side tell the story of the Old Testament of the early Old Testament, the first books. On the other side are the prophets and the poets of the Old Testament, and around the nave are the stories of the New Testament. It is a marvelous experience to go into Sainte-Chapelle and just sit and look at the stained glass windows, and for yourself work out the stories. You can see Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. You can see Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, the story of Abraham and Isaac. It is just a marvelous experience to sit there and take a few minutes. Then, let me recommend something else to do. In the evening, you can go back to Sainte-Chapelle, and for a relatively small fee, you can attend a concert. I remember a concert that I went to there was a Mozart concert, and another time I went to Sainte-Chapelle and I heard a Vivaldi concert of Four Seasons. It is a delight. So when you're in Paris, just enjoy some of these cultural events like Sainte-Chapelle. If you go 20 or 30 miles, maybe a little further, 40 miles perhaps, away from Paris, you come to a place called Chartres. It is a small town with a hill in the middle of the town, and on top of the hill is perhaps the best example of all of the elements of a Gothic cathedral. Here we see a picture of the cathedral at Chartres, and in addition to that, we see a floor plan where you can see the various elements of a Gothic cathedral. It's a great experience to go into this church, officially called Notre Dame des Chartres, and see the many parts of the church that so typically identify a Gothic cathedral. Let me give you some examples. Chartres is a pilgrimage site. The reason is because they have what they claim was the cloth that Mary wore when Christ was born, Mary's tunic. Then in addition to that, there are traditions that because it was a pilgrimage site, there would be fairs held there in the city of Chartres each year. There were 4 of them that were authorized. And you could not just hold a fair. It had to be authorized by the church or the state. And in the case of Chartres, this was an important site, and therefore 4 fairs were authorized each year. The bishop, at the time that the church was being built, or just prior to it being built, was afraid that other locations would steal the business from Chartres, and he would not be able to get the money and retain the prestige that he had been used to, and therefore he was the one who strongly recommended that the Cathedral of Chartres be built. Here's a brief video that talks about his vision for this cathedral.
But he must have impressed Renaud, as he is appointed master builder of the new Chartres Cathedral. It's a daunting challenge. The old cathedral was long and narrow, but a common shape is not enough for Bishop Renaud. He wants his new cathedral to be the cutting edge of its day. He transforms the rectangle to a cross large enough to be seen by God in heaven. It's an ambitious vision, but at its heart are 3 simple shapes.
The builder would use simple geometric shapes for the cathedral's design.
For Professor Michael Davis of Mount Holyoke College, such shapes were crucial to medieval architecture.
These would be the circle, the square, and the equilateral triangle. These shapes were included in every aspect of the cathedral's design.
To the medieval mind, The circle, square, and triangle were uniquely harmonious, reflecting man's desire to be at one with the divine spirit. The circle is a sacred symbol of purity. Outside a circle can be drawn a perfect square. By diagonally bisecting the perfect square, we arrive at 4 triangles. Every single element of the design uses derivatives of these 3 shapes.
He tried to retain all of the previous elements of the Gothic style. High nave, high roof, and in fact, Chartres is higher than Notre Dame. It has beautiful flying buttresses, and in fact, the people at Chartres claim that their flying buttresses preceded the ones at Notre Dame in being built. They have a labyrinth, and here we see a picture of the labyrinth. It's fun to go into Chartres and walk through the labyrinth and try and get to the center. The labyrinth was used as a method of devotion because people would crawl the labyrinth. And even today, occasionally you can see someone crawling the labyrinth as a way of paying for their sins. There were gift windows, and we can talk about that in just a moment. And the entire building was a theme for the heavenly city. Here we see some windows that were donated to Chartres. They were gifted by different groups, and in this case we see windows that were gifted by the Bell Makers Guild. And these windows would explain the various steps in making bells and would be a source of pride for the bell makers of the city. Here's another window that was donated by wealthy patrons. They would just simply donate this window with their name and associated with it, much like people today give gifts to concert halls or hospitals with their name attached. Here is another very interesting discussion of some of the building and the symbolism within the Chartres Cathedral.
The next morning, I set out for the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Chartres. They say that to see it is like seeing the walls of Jerusalem, the heavenly city. What I saw exceeded all my expectations. It reaches toward the heavens. The architects had built real mountains right up to the clouds.
And the city was pure gold, like unto clear glass, having the glory of God. And her light was like unto a stone most precious. And she had a wall great and high, and had 12 gates.
The builders of Chartres took as their model the description of the heavenly Jerusalem in the book of Revelation.
And the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God did lighten it.
Chartres Cathedral is regarded as one of the most significant works of Gothic architecture, and by some as its peak.
I had permission to climb the tower. The framework is of stone everywhere. They now put windows where once they built massive walls. These are bold designs. The builders compete with one another, each striving to outdo the others. It takes great knowledge of the balance of forces to erect such a building.
The builders' motto was bigger, higher, brighter. But to achieve this, they first had to develop a new style of construction. For structural engineers today, Gothic cathedrals are still miracles. The nave and the aisles are made up of dozens of modules. The whole weight of the vault and the roof rests on just 4 columns. Virtually impossible. Surely they would have to collapse. But flying buttresses transfer the forces outwards, where buttresses absorb them. This design, with mutually supporting modules, was a brilliant solution to structural problems. It enabled buildings to be made both taller and lighter than ever before. Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis gave his master builder these instructions.
The whole church should be illuminated by the wonderful light from the many-colored windows. As it is written, I am the light of the world, and he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have eternal life.
Bourges Cathedral in France. Here, on a mezzanine floor, the secrets of the builders were uncovered. How did they manage to build tracery windows without mortar or gaps, when everything had to fit together precisely? There is a clue in a barely visible drawing incised into the floor around the year 1300. The foremen of the building workshops were also the architects. When construction began, they had only a rough idea of the design of the cathedral. Only as the work progressed did their visions take shape. For example, the large windows. Building historians are now researching how cathedrals slowly grew from the architect's initial ideas. This incised drawing of a window, preserved at Bourges, shows how its proportions were worked out. Jean-Yves Ribaud has measured every single mullion and trefoil in the tracery of the window and compared each with the drawing. Building historians regard the cathedral architects as geniuses. Without the benefit of modern engineering formulas, they built the skyscrapers of the Middle Ages. They learned from experience while building them with the simplest of tools. Cathedral construction was the most advanced form of medieval building. There were manuals for it, such as Viard d'Ancourt's book from 1230.
In this book, one may find ample advice on the skills of bricklaying and drawing, done as geometry demands. If you wish to build a good spire, such as that in Laon, you must use buttresses.
Viard's book contains examples of a perfect synthesis of technology and the art of building. With Gothic architecture, Europe had found a common language of stone and glass. There were few large cities without a Gothic cathedral. In France alone, more than 80 cathedrals and 500 large churches were built during the Middle Ages. The builders and their teams traveled from one building site to the next, thus ensuring the spread of technology and innovation. This set in motion a development comparable with the Industrial Revolution. Cathedrals were the symbols of a new age.
Well, France wasn't the only place to have Gothic cathedrals, although it was initially called the French style. But afterward, people in England adopted the Gothic style, and here we see a church that is an example of what we call the English vertical Gothic style. It is much, much higher than the French style, and it has more elaborate reinforcements. I think it's very lovely, and you can see that it's somewhat similar to the eating place in Harry Potter movies, which were adapted and perhaps even used one of these large cathedrals as their place of filming. Here we see Canterbury Chapel, and I'm discussing what we can see in the nave of Canterbury.
Now you see, here we can look down the main part of the nave, and this is along with the nave on the other side that we'll see in a moment, the largest nave of any medieval church in Europe. That means that it's exceeded in length only by some of the Renaissance churches such as St. Peter's in Rome.
Again, we can see very high, the English vertical style, and some of the beautiful windows, and a beautiful pulpit inside Canterbury. It is truly a lovely church. Here's a church in the north of England called York Minster. York was the second most important religious area in England after Canterbury, and the church in York is very large and really beautifully done. Again, lots of windows. These windows are somewhat different. They all have a gray-green tint to them, and it's quite unusual to see windows of the style in York. I remember when I was at the York Minster, I took a guided tour by some of the very friendly people who were there to just simply help you enjoy the experience of going to York. And I would recommend strongly that you take one of those guided tours. While on that tour, they pointed to the line of kings that are on a wall that separates the altar from the nave. And it's interesting to see each of the kings along that line. And the last one, as you look at it, the last one is Henry VI. You see something a little bit unusual. The head is quite different. And you wonder, I wonder why that head is different. And then we were told that the head is different because in the anger of the War of the Roses, where it was York against Lancaster, this Lancastrian king had his head just simply knocked off by the angry people. But then, after the Lancastrians regained power, his head was restored by the other side. It's really fun to see it. Here are some other ceilings. These are not in churches, but they are in interesting palaces that have this style called the hammer-beamed ceilings. They're wooden. The beam goes up and then it's supported on the ends. One of these is in Hampton Court Palace, which is the favorite palace of Henry VIII. I recommend strongly that everyone who goes to London should take a half a day and go out to Hampton Court and see this very, very beautiful palace. And there's a lot of fun out there too, because at least on the day that I went there, and I think it's true every day, they have a wedding. And the wedding is Henry VIII to the last of his wives. And they put on a great little performance and recruit you to be part of the performance. I happen to be a person who worked in the kitchen, and my job was to turn the spit so that the meat would be roasted. And then later I was invited to go into the presence of the king, and they actually recognized me as a worker in the kitchen and congratulated me on the work that I did. It was a lot of fun, just tremendous experience. Besides that, there are beautiful gardens. It's a wonderful place. The other hammer-beamed ceiling is in Westminster Hall. That is central to Houses of Parliament. So when you go into Houses of Parliament on the tour, and again, I recommend that strongly for everyone who goes to London, you should spend about a half a day and go into Houses of Parliament, and there they'll take you into Westminster Hall, and you wait to be divided up into tour groups, and then you go through, and when you finish again in Westminster Hall. It is a delightful experience, and as you can see, the ceiling is very interesting. The Germans and Italians also adopted the Gothic style. Here we can see the cathedral in Cologne. Again, it is marvelous. It's a beautiful cathedral, very, very high. It sits near the Rhine River, and I've hiked up to the top of that cathedral tower. It is a long way up. My legs hurt for a week afterward, but it's fun to go up and you get a tremendous view of the Rhine. Here's another favorite cathedral of mine. It's the Gothic Cathedral in Milan. The outside decorations are especially good. On one side, they have all of the apostles, and they are shown in their traditional manner of death. So Peter is shown there upside down being crucified. In addition to that, the inside of the Milan Cathedral is beautiful, has very large paintings suspended from the ceiling. Again, it's a great opportunity to go there. It's interesting that the Milan Cathedral affected the cathedral in Florence. The people in Florence were anxious to build a cathedral, but they didn't want to build one in the Gothic style because they were anxious to avoid any competition with Milan. And therefore, they began to build a cathedral in a new style. And they couldn't quite do it because they built this cathedral so large that they couldn't find a way to put a dome on the round area, on the circular area underneath what would be a dome. Therefore, for many generations, the cathedral in Florence did not have a dome. It took the Renaissance to find a way to do that. We'll talk about that next semester. Well, this competition between cathedrals became very, very important. Cathedrals competed to be bigger or higher, hoping that people would come just to see the cathedral. I've been to several cathedrals in Europe. I remember I went to one in Strasbourg. And in Strasbourg, they have a sound and light show to show off the height and the beauty. Strasbourg is very, very high. And so even today, they feature these cathedrals as a way to draw people to their city. I remember walking down the aisle at St. Peter's in Rome. And as you walk down the aisle looking toward the altar, you'll see a little sign on the floor, and the sign will say, Florence Cathedral, Cathedral in Milan, Cathedral here, Cathedral there. And those are the various sizes of the naves of these other cathedrals. And of course, the implication in St. Peter's, which is larger than all of them, is to show you how tremendously large St. Peter's is. This reminds me somewhat of an earlier lecture in this course where we talked about the pharaohs and how they tried to build bigger and better pyramids and bigger and better temples. Today, we see a similar competition among skyscrapers. I remember when the Empire State Building was the highest building in the world, and now it's been surpassed multiple times. At this date, I think the highest building is in Dubai. But there are many others that claim to be higher, and probably there will be others that become higher even yet. There's also an interesting competition along that same line for building the largest football stadium. And so it's interesting to see these concepts of the ancient world being carried on even today. So we ask ourselves this question: what was creative about the Gothic cathedral? Was it just the pointy arch? I think not. I think there are other things besides that. It was the openness, the feeling, the light, the elevation of one's spirit when you go to church. I've been to many of these churches, and some are kind of dark. Notre Dame is a little bit dark. But I've been to others that have an uplift, a light that is just tremendous. You have to remember that just putting the windows in darkens the inside of the church. You can't have both, it seems. But I recommend strongly that you go and enjoy the spirit of this light and height and feeling that you get from a Gothic cathedral. We ask ourselves, why do we build great edifices? sometimes to draw people to our city, but I think in general it is to glory God. The Catholic Church really did want to show reverence for God. And to some extent, that's why we build beautiful temples in the LDS Church. It is to show a reverence for God, a lifting of the spirit of those who go to the temple. I've been in many of the LDS temples and had this feeling of elevation. It is a marvelous experience. And I suppose for Catholics, they might receive an elevated experience. And I would too, as a tourist in many of their churches. It is nice to go to a beautiful edifice and remember that those are beautiful things to honor God. But now we have to ask ourselves an interesting question. Why was the Gothic considered ugly by those in the Renaissance? Partly, I think, because the Renaissance dismissed everything about the Middle Ages. They were only focused on ancient Greece and Rome. Anything that deviated from ancient Greece and Rome had to be bad, according to the Renaissance. Even the beautiful churches of the Gothic period. Nevertheless, after the Renaissance, little by little, the Gothic churches were brought back into esteem by the world, and of course today the Gothic churches are considered some of the most beautiful edifices in the world. We ask ourselves, what does Gothic mean today? Originally it meant barbarian, named after the Goths, the tribe that conquered Rome. And there are some people who are Gothic in their dress, and that means dark or foreboding, and they tend to dress all in black. But Gothic, I think, means today a period of great creativity in the Middle Ages, a period where beautiful buildings were built, sometimes by fantastic capabilities of creative men who brought all of their skill and their creativity together to build these beautiful buildings. Let's be thankful for them. Visit them when you can. Be grateful for their creativity. Thank you very much.